for those of you that are curious, who is this guy? Would like to know a little bit more about my background. This is my testimony. I call it, my journey to a meaningful relationship with God. Although I don't remember much about the relationship that may have existed between myself and God when He was in the process of creating and defining my spirit, I suppose He must have made a good impression because when I was older and learned of Him, I remember being curious to know more about Him. By the time I arrived on this planet, my mother, who had been raised in a Catholic home, was pretty much an agnostic. She knew there was something out there, but she also knew it wasn't the Catholic Church. And my father, who had been raised in a Jewish home, had become an atheist. As far as he was concerned, there was no God. He, along with my mother and me, observed Passover by attending a family Passover Seder every year hosted by my father's sister. He did this primarily, I think, to honor his father more than anything else. In the little shopping center across the road from the house I grew up in was, among other things, a Christian Science reading room. I remember going in there a few times when I was around 7 years old and talking with the lady who worked there. I don't remember much about the conversations we had, although I remember her telling me that there were two accounts of creation in the book of Genesis, one in chapter 1 and the other in chapter 2. Outside of that, I don't remember getting much information about God or the Bible from those visits, but I was intrigued by the things of God that the reading room represented. On the street where I lived, most of the other families were Catholic, and I was considered to be Jewish. I'm not quite sure why that was, unless it was an assumption because we weren't Christian, or at least we didn't attend church. There was only one other family on my block that was identified as Jewish, but they, like my family, weren't particularly religious. My mother had a daily Roman missal. I wasn't sure what it was, although it was very obviously some kind of religious book. I don't think my mother had much use for it, because although I'm not sure exactly what I was thinking, but for some reason I ended up with it most of the time. As you might imagine, in a home like mine, I never had any formal religious instruction of any kind. I remember one time asking my mother what happens to us when we die. She took a few minutes to share her thoughts on that subject, which I don't remember. Although I don't remember asking her about God, it was possible that I did, as I couldn't help hearing about Him from the Catholic kids on my block. I do remember hanging out with some of the other kids on my block when they talked about the things of God. Actually, maybe more things of church. They talked about Our Lady of Fatima, and they talked to other such supernatural apparitions. I don't know I didn't know what to make of it, although I remember being frightened by the thought of experiencing one, particularly of an appearance by Jesus in my bedroom. I remember having questions about their beliefs and practices, which they did their best to answer, although I found it interesting. None of it made much of an impression on me. The big shift in my spirituality came when I was about 9 or 10 years old. The housing tract I live in had been built in what had been a very rural area, and the land where my house stood had previously been farmland, potatoes, and there had been a forested area of which a small portion, known to us kids as Duffy's Woods, remained. It was in this last vestige of wilderness that we kids would often go, especially in the summer, to play camping or army. It was on one such occasion that I met God. To put this part of my story in context for those who aren't familiar with New York summers, it must be explained that summer in New York was often very uncomfortable as temperatures soared and humidity was high. Frequently on such days, a thunderstorm would suddenly appear late in the afternoon or early evening, and often coincidentally bring some degree of relief from the heat and humidity. It was on one such summer's day that I found myself playing with my friends in Duffy's Woods when a horrendous late afternoon thunderstorm broke upon us. Not knowing what else to do in the midst of the tumultuous rain, we kids huddled under the trees for shelter. One of the other kids suggested that we pray. I had no experience with such things and so asked him what he meant. By way of explanation, he told me to say, "Now I lay me down to sleep, giving God my soul to keep. If I die before I wake, I give God my soul to take." I was willing to try it, but as I repeated what he had told me, I didn't see much connection to the need for it to stop raining, so I stuck a "and please make it stop raining" in between the prayer he had told me that I was repeating. Much to my surprise, within a couple of minutes, the rain stopped, although it was still very overcast and stormy. It was in that moment I came to believe in the reality of God. Now that the rain had stopped, we kids could head back to our homes. Coming out of the woods, there was some open space before we could get to the road we had to cross to return to our neighborhood. In this open space was a rectangular patch of some tall grass-like plant that looked to me to be wheat. Although all of the other kids just walked right through it, I walked around it. My thinking was it was a patch of God's wheat, and since he had made the rain stop for me, it was only right that I not walk through what I saw as his wheat. Although I had come to believe in God as a result of that experience, I did not start going to church or reading the Bible. I don't think there actually was a Bible in our house. I just was convinced that he was real. Somewhere in my childhood, maybe when I was around 8 or 9 years old, I had come to the conclusion that my parents were good for providing my food, clothing, and shelter, but when it came to any of my other needs, particularly emotional ones, I was on my own in getting them met. The reason I interject this here is because the relationship I had with God was pretty much modeled on the relationship I had with my parents. He was there if I needed anything, but I had no idea what having an actual relationship with him involved. The next time I went to God was about 6 months later when my cat went to the veterinarian. I should point out that as an only child, my cat was my companion and playmate. When one of his forelegs started to swell, I knew something was wrong, although I didn't know it at the time. It was abscessed. I pointed it out to my mother, who said the cat should go to the vet, and so we took him. Of course, I figured if God could quiet a thunderstorm, he could heal my cat, so I took my situation to him for resolution. However, as it turned out, my cat never returned home. To say I was disappointed would be an understatement. I definitely was angry and disillusioned with God. I couldn't understand why he let my cat die. As it turned out, some 50 years later, in a phone conversation, my mother, for some reason, felt the need to confess to me that she had told the vet to put the cat down when we took him in. By that time, I had gotten over the loss and had no animosity toward her for what she told me she had done. It occurred to me, however, to wonder how often God ends up getting blamed for what are actually the consequences of human free will decisions. About 6 months after the loss of my cat, I had a very unusual sort of epiphany as I was walking home from the store where I had gone to get an after-dinner treat for myself. This is what it was. I realized that just being alive was a magnificent gift from God. And in light of that revelation, I realized he didn't owe me anything. Where this thought came from, I do not have the slightest idea. However, it enabled me to release my anger at him and have a restored relationship with him. On one occasion, when I was around 16, I remember sitting at the kitchen table with my father and another person, and our discussion had somehow gotten on the subject of Jesus. I was wondering, what did Jesus look like? Was he skinny or fat, dark complexioned or light, and other such profound questions? That is when my father suggested that, in light of my questions, I might want to read the book The Last Temptation of Christ by Nikos Kazantzakis. I don't remember if he had gotten it in paperback for me or if I got it for myself, but I did read it. Not having actually read the Bible, I had no context to compare it to. However, it had a powerful effect on me. Whereas I previously had been terrified at the prospect of having Jesus appear in my bedroom some night, I now was excited about such an experience occurring. One of my best friends in high school, Patrick, was an Irish Catholic, and on a few occasions I accepted his invitation and accompanied him to the Mass at the Catholic church in town he regularly attended. Although a lot of what went on meant little to me, I was impressed with the ritual. Although generally there weren't many occasions when I went to him for anything particular, I had this feeling that he was present, watching over me, somehow was involved in my life, and that I was special to him. I remember one occasion when I was a senior walking home from the high school on a Friday night after a basketball game. Although I didn't play and wasn't a particular fan, somehow I had landed the job of covering the basketball team's activities for a student newspaper. While walking home that night, for some reason, feeling the absence of a sibling, I had a long and in-depth conversation with God about how I would like to have a brother. In the course of the conversation, I realized that even if my mother were to become pregnant that night, it really wouldn't fix my problem, since the age difference would not be conducive to the kind of relationship I desired. What makes this interesting is that the next day, Peter, the boy who grew up living next door to me and was currently off at college, was unexpectedly home for the weekend. I was excited to see him, as he was a good friend, and we had done many things together in the past while he was still living at home. As it turned out, we had occasion to hang out together that day. First, we went across the street to a neighbor who had known us for 11 plus years. The funny thing, though, was that he kept calling me Peter and calling Peter Paul. After that, Peter had to go into town to the sporting goods store where he had worked at his last summer before going off to college, and he invited me to go with him. While we were there, his former employer asked him if I were his brother. I tell you this because I came away from that weekend believing that God had answered my prayer for a brother the best he could by showing me that Peter was the best he could do in providing me a brother. It wasn't too long after that I had another need I took to him. My senior year in high school was just about finished, and I was having to take the New York State Regents exams at the end of my senior year. It was important to pass these exams, or otherwise, regardless of my actual grades, I wouldn't get my diploma. Since I had faithfully attended my second year in Latin class, and usually was an active participant, I knew that all the information I would need to pass the exam was in my brain somewhere. My prayer was that God would bring the information I needed to my remembrance to enable me to pass the exam. As it turned out, I scored a little above the 65% I needed to pass the Latin 2 Regents exam. I was happy to have passed and believed that God had answered my prayer, giving me what I needed and nothing more, as I thought that was all I deserved anyway, in light of my lack of discipline in regard to my study habits. Although I can't think of any events over the next few years where God played a part, there were two things that stood out. One was attending church, probably sometime in 1964 or 1965, with Judy, my girlfriend fiancée at the time, who was a Lutheran. It was pretty much the first time for me at a Protestant church. I didn't necessarily understand all that was going on, but I enjoyed the service and was open to going again. Also, I remember going to the movies around that time and seeing King of Kings and being impressed with who Jesus was. There was one other thing. Although I wasn't proactively pursuing a relationship with him at the time, I always had the feeling that I was special to him and that he was looking out for me. One thing led to another, and I ended up moving to Manhattan, New York City in 1966, where I had landed a job as a promotional copywriter for a large and well-known publishing house, McGraw-Hill. Through all this time, I really didn't think much about God, although landing that job reaffirmed my belief that I was special to him and that he was watching out for me. At the time, my roommate, Brian, was storing sugar cubes in our refrigerator for sale laced with LSD, and he was smoking marijuana. As a good roommate, of course, he invited me to partake. I declined, telling him, "No thanks, I'll probably like it and become addicted." I don't remember exactly how I met Pierrette, but she had a major impact on my life. She was a 42-year-old woman who had emigrated from France, and after our paths crossed, she had apparently found the 22-year-old me attractive. I can't tell you how flattered I was by her attention. Not having too much of a success with women of any age, despite my brief relationship with Judy, I figured I must have something women would want if a 42-year-old French woman found me attractive. Pierrette occasionally might smoke some marijuana, and so it happened that one evening when I was visiting her, she was smoking a joint and offered me a hit. Not wanting to offend her, I took a couple of hits. I don't remember that it affected me very much, but I had crossed the line from not using to smoking pot. The relationship with Pierrette came to an amicable end not too long after that, when I realized that the age difference between us really didn't make much sense for a relationship. Shortly thereafter, I met another woman, Olga, who was closer to my age and incidentally a real pothead. Because I had already crossed the line, I didn't hesitate when she offered me a joint. However, the stuff she had was really potent. From the one weekend evening of smoking, I remained high for the rest of the week. Olga and I apparently made plans to move to an apartment together on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, the New York City equivalent of San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury. After giving up my apartment on New York City's Upper East Side and having moved into the apartment I had rented for us on the Lower East Side, Olga broke up with me. I was devastated. The only way I could get through my grief was to smoke some of the dynamite grass I had scored from Olga's dealer before our breakup. Not only did it allow me to distract myself from my grief, but I realized that in many ways it was what I came to see as the missing ingredient from my life. I made a vow to remain high until I forgot what it was like to be straight. I would smoke continuously from the time I got up in the morning until the time I went to sleep at night. This was a commitment that I honored even after moving back to my parents' house. For all intents and purposes, I came to believe that being high was necessary for me to be able to function in this world. That was when I entered the world of hippies. In that subculture, I was instantly accepted by the other hippies. It was an unusual experience for me, and I enjoyed the feeling of being part of something bigger than myself. I had an experience that, although at the time I didn't think it had anything to do with God, in hindsight, it looks like maybe it did. I had gone to the apartment of the dealer who Olga had introduced me to. I was informed when I entered the apartment that I was under arrest, as was the dealer. The police had busted him and were raiding around to see who else they could arrest. I had a very small amount of marijuana on me, but it was enough to have gotten me sent to jail. time, uh, in the time that the agents were waiting around, the dealer managed to slip out the window and down the fire escape. When the police finally got tired of waiting around, they were embarrassed to find that the main violator was nowhere to be found. So in their frustration, they let everyone else go. If it hadn't happened that way, I might have had to spend the night or longer in an infamous New York City jail known as the Tombs, which I was spared by the grace of God. After moving back to my parents' house and going back to college in 1967, I met a woman at the college and fell in love again. She would become my first wife and the mother of my first child. We weren't married yet when she informed me that she was pregnant. To me, it was a sign. Of all the women I had had intercourse with, and they were all unprotected, no contraceptives, she was the one that was carrying my child. The thought of being a father excited me, as I had thought that being a father would be a satisfying role. Now, this part of my story may seem out of place since God doesn't play an obvious part in it, but it forms an important part of my relationship with the Lord, as you will see later. While she was still pregnant, we headed out to California and were married on the way in Las Vegas in May of 1968. When my son Peter was born that December, I stepped into the role of being a father. Although, of course, he was too young to do much with, I helped his mother with the day-to-day responsibilities of taking care of an infant. When he was about 8 months old, Walt Disney's Peter Pan was having a revival and was playing at a local drive-in. Being one of my favorite childhood movies, I took him to see it, although I suppose he was really too young to have much idea what he was seeing. Since I was unemployed when we had gotten out to San Francisco in September of 1968, and she was pregnant, his mother and I applied for Aid to Families with Dependent Children, AFDC. At that time, a condition of receiving aid would be my participation in what the Social Services Department called the WIN, Work Incentive Program. This program provided tuition for going to school to learn a marketable skill, or financial incentives for an employer to hire me on as a trainee. Had I had my way, I would have used this as an opportunity to learn to be a record producer. As it was, I ended up as a trainee for several months at a listener-supported radio station in Berkeley, where I had the privilege of producing their first live music broadcast when they went to stereo broadcasting in October of 1969. Although this may not seem an important part of the story of my coming to have a relationship with the Lord, it was just one of the mysterious ways in which He directed me, as will become apparent later in the story. As Peter got older and was able to be more active, I remember spending time playing with him at home. His mother ended up working evenings and nights, and I would frequently take him with me when I went to hang out with friends while she was working. Unfortunately, our marriage was having some serious problems, and by 1971, she apparently had had enough, filing for divorce. Amazingly, we actually lived together while the divorce was in progress, and so I was able to spend time with my son. After the divorce was finalized, his mother took him back to New York with her when she returned to her parents' home. I made the decision to also return to my parents' home in Hicksville, New York, because I wanted to be more than a voice on the phone to Peter. I packed up all his toys on the roof rack of my Volkswagen van and headed back to New York a few weeks after Peter and his mother had flown back. I would see him fairly regularly, often bringing him to my parents' house, and sometimes he would even spend the night with me at their house. This would continue while he was living in New York at his maternal grandparents' house, and even after his mother remarried. It was during this time that I met Barry, an optician who worked at the local Sears in 1972. I was then working at a restaurant as the assistant to the chef. When I was laid off, I got a job as a cook at a Howard Johnson restaurant quite a distance from my parents' house where I was staying. As it turned out, Barry had a condominium he lived in that was quite close to that restaurant. He had gotten it when he was engaged. However, his fiancée had broken the engagement, and he invited me to move into the empty spare bedroom, which I did. It was shortly after that I became unemployed when I was laid off at the restaurant. I had been thinking that I would look for work at another restaurant. In talking to Barry about my plans, he suggested something that would, years later, have eternal consequences. Aware that I had worked at the radio station in Berkeley, he suggested that I look for a job at a local radio station, of which there happened to be three in the nearby large town. So I put in an application at each of them, being offered a job at WSUF-AM. The fact that I had production experience was the deal maker for them. However, they also needed an on-air personality for the weekday afternoon air shift, and so that fell to me as well as producing commercials and public affairs programming. Peter would sometimes stay with me while I was living at Barry's. After about 5 months on the job, my employer had fallen a month behind in the payroll, and I had to go to the Labor Relations Board to get them to pay me. Of course, I quit shortly thereafter and found new employment. In 1973, I was working in upstate New York on weekends selling recreational community home sites and would sometimes bring Peter with me. When that job ended, I got a job in 1974 as a first-run movie theater manager and as house manager for a music concert hall. Sometimes I would bring Peter to work so he could watch the movies. I maintained that type of relationship with him until I made the decision to return to California in the spring of 1975. During the time I was working as a theater manager, The Exorcist came out. Since I could see it for free, I went to see it. I had to constantly keep reminding myself it was only a movie because the premise of satanic possession was a pretty frightening concept that was hard to get my mind around. Shortly after I returned to California, Peter's mother and her husband made the decision to move to Florida, and of course Peter went with them. After the move, my son and I kept in touch as best we could in between the visits that we coordinated so that he and I could be together at my parents' house pretty much once a year, usually in the summer when he had a vacation from school. It was during one such visit in the beginning of the summer of 1978 that Peter informed me that he was being harassed, abused by his stepfather. He had told his mother about it, and she spoke to the stepfather. Afterwards, the stepfather told Peter that if he thought things were bad now, he should see how bad they could get if he talked to his mother about it again. When I heard this, I immediately decided that he would not be going back to his mother in Florida. Rather, he would accompany me back to California at the conclusion of our visit in New York, which he did. In California, I remember that for the first time I really felt like a father, and the idea of raising him on my own really excited me. Although I took him with me when I went to see an attorney about getting legal custody, I never did anything to bring that about. We did things together, one of which was to make root beer from scratch using root beer flavored syrup and yeast to make the carbonation. I also remember having had a great adventure with him one day in a nearby state park. At the end of the summer, his mother called and told me that his stepfather had gotten some help and that things had gotten better. The point of telling me all of this was that she wanted Peter to return to her because she wanted him to continue going to school at the school he had been going to. I don't remember what I told her at the time, but I ended up talking with Peter about it. For some reason, probably my codependence, I wanted his mother to think kindly of me. I wanted her to know that I was on her side and that I was really a nice guy. The long and short of it was that I began to work on Peter to consider returning. We created a code phrase, Sammy's back, that Peter could use to let me know if things really weren't better. I don't know what I thought I could or would do if he used that code, but it seemed to give him the confidence to go back to Florida and allowed me to feel like I was doing the right thing. However, I remember after his flight took off from San Francisco International Airport that I was in the parking lot in the back of my Volkswagen van listening over and over to Stevie Wonder's Superstition and crying my heart out for about 20 minutes. I'm not sure why, except, in addition to missing him, maybe there was a part of me that realized sending him back was really a bad decision. After he had been back home with his mother for a few weeks, he used the code phrase when we were talking on the phone, but I had no idea what I could do about it. Aside from not wanting to upset his mother by demanding his return to me, I didn't have the slightest idea what I could do, aside from encouraging him to hang in there. For the next few years, I did the best I could to maintain a relationship with him, sending cassette tapes back and forth and calling him regularly. Under the circumstances, I thought I was being a good dad. That year in 1979, I got a job working with a printer, Walter, in his print shop. Although he didn't appear to be very spiritual, his wife, Rosemary, was a committed Christian. Knowing I had no family in the area, Rosemary invited me over to their house for Thanksgiving dinner. Interestingly enough, the Jesus of Nazareth miniseries was airing, and she had it on the television while I was there. I found what little of it I was able to watch intriguing. Although she didn't say anything about it, seeing that I didn't appear to have a relationship with God, I believe that Rosemary was praying for me to get to know him. And actually, I did confirm with her that I was in her prayers. In 1980, Peter's mother called me and told me she was going to divorce his stepdad and wanted Peter to come and stay with me while she pursued that. So Peter came to stay and go to school. At the time, I was renting a room in a house in Oakland that he shared with me. However, it was getting kind of crowded in that room, so the next year we found a house where we could rent 2 rooms, one for him and one for me. The other 2 bedrooms were each occupied by a woman and her young son. Both were too young to be a playmate for Peter. I developed a relationship with one of the women, Rainey, and with her young son, Namid. One afternoon I noticed Rainey reading a book titled Think and Grow Rich. Intrigued by the title, I asked her what it was about. One thing she mentioned was that it talked about the power of tithing to gain wealth. Now, I had first heard of tithing back in high school history class. It was 1/10 of one's income traditionally given to the church, but I didn't remember anything about it being a way to become wealthy. Since her answer wasn't very enlightening and I didn't want to spend any time actually reading the book for myself, I thanked her and dropped the subject. Although we broke up a few years later in 1982, after we had moved from Oakland and had been living together in Sonoma County, I continued to maintain a relationship with her son with whom I had bonded. At that time, I was working as a telemarketer 20 hours a week for $500 a month gross. I made calls on behalf of an insulation company. I lost my place here. Yeah, here we go. Insulation company. Back in the day, when Pacific Gas and Electric offered a zero-interest loan program for homeowners to finance insulating their homes. I made appointments for a home inspection, and if the appointment resulted in the prospect buying an insulation job, I was supposed to get a commission. However, although sales must have been made, I never saw any commissions. I probably should mention that although Rainey and I were no longer living together, I continued to have what you might call visitation with Namid. I figured the fact that his mother and I weren't living together, her idea, was no reason our relationship should suffer. The only downside was that in order to see him, I had to see her when I picked him up or dropped him off. Seeing her was painful for me because I still felt love for her and wanted to have a relationship with her. Seeing her just reminded me of that. However, my pot smoking helped cushion my grief. Looking back on that time, I don't even know how I managed to make ends meet financially. I was just barely able to pay my bills. So it wasn't long before I began looking for a better paying job. One day, while scanning the newspaper, that's how long ago that was, I noticed an ad for a radio station looking for someone. Having worked professionally in radio back in New York as a result of Barry's suggestion that I look for work at a radio station, I stopped and read the ad more closely. I was disappointed to discover it wasn't actually a paying job, but rather a volunteer opportunity. Someone was going to be starting our local Christian music radio station and was looking for individuals to volunteer 4 hours per week. Needless to say, I continued reading the want ads. After another week or so without much success in finding anything, something occurred to me relating to tithing. Although I couldn't see how I could possibly tithe on my minimum cash income, I realized if I actually had a 40-hour-a-week job, 4 hours a week would be 10%. The radio station ad was still in the paper, so I contacted them. I believed in God, however, I certainly didn't consider myself a Christian at the time. Despite that, I submitted my application and I got the job. Shortly thereafter, I began training at the radio station, which wouldn't be going on the air for at least another month. Back on the old job, I wasn't the only one calling to make appointments. One afternoon, a coworker got off the phone from what had obviously been a personal call. We were friends, so I casually asked her who she'd been talking with. When she told me it was her father, for some unknown reason I asked what type of work he did. She told me that he sold wine with custom labels over the phone. I was intrigued. Later that week, I went to the place her dad worked to apply for a job. The sales manager who did the hiring commented several times that my timing was impeccable. After reviewing my extensive qualifications as a telemarketer, he offered me a position. Although I would only be going to work 10 more hours a week, for a total of 30 hours, he was offering me double what I had made at my old job, for a total of $1,000 per month, plus commissions, which, as it turned out, I actually received. So I took home significantly more than my salary. As a result of these events, which I believe were not purely coincidental, in retrospect I came to the conclusion that my decision to tithe had been an invitation I had offered God to show me that He was my provider. Consequently, I came to trust that He would take care of me financially. Shortly thereafter, in late 1982, I actually started working as a volunteer at the Christian radio station, and a few months later, I became a follower of Christ. When I started attending church, I began to tithe from my gross income, a habit that I've continued to practice for the past 40 years. In all that time, I've never gone without. I've always had an adequate income, a place to live, food to eat, and a working vehicle to get me from point A to point B. However, several life-changing things happened while I was a volunteer at the radio station that was known as KCLB and later became, after my departure, K-Love. When I started, I was not attending church and really didn't consider myself to be a Christian. However, when the station first went on the air, I realized something about the secular music I had been listening to up to that point. The songs pretty much had in common the belief that I was miserable because my woman had gone, and that I would only be happy if I had a relationship with my woman. Since listening to such lyrics only reinforced my misery, I thought, maybe I should be listening to something more uplifting. And so I not only volunteered at the station, but I started to listen to it. At that time, the music program ended about 10 p.m. and was replaced with what might be considered Christian educational programs, which I found interesting, and so I listened to them also. When I was on duty as a volunteer from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. on Sundays to pass the time between changing the hour-long tape reels containing the music programming, I would read the study guides that were in the control room, which went with the late night programming. I would also have interaction with the other volunteers, who were mostly Christians. That affected me. One conversation helped me to get a better handle on the concept of Satan, whereas I had previously come to the conclusion that Satan was a personification of all of the evil in the hearts of humans. I was informed that, according to the Bible, which I had a great deal of respect for, Satan was actually a created being who fell from heaven. Another volunteer who had a big impact on me, on life, was a woman who, knowing I was unchurched, ended up inviting me to attend a church service with her. Of course, I accepted the invitation, hoping that a relationship with her might result. I ended up going to the church she invited me to attend that first day, even though she couldn't attend. Interestingly enough, the Saturday, February 19th, 1983, before I was going to go to church with her, was one of those days when I had time with Namid and it was going to precipitate, pardon me. So it was going to precipitate an event that significantly impacted my journey to a closer relationship with the Lord. Again, seeing his mother only brought out my pain and sorrow. It was so bad that even the little bit of marijuana I had left wasn't seeming to help. That's when, in my desperation, I called out to God, God, I don't know how to live my life. I can't make it work. You're going to have to do it. When I awoke that next morning, to my surprise, I discovered I no longer had any desire to smoke marijuana. I went to the church I had been invited to early enough to attend the adult Sunday school as well as the service. The church was rather large, and no one came up to introduce themselves to the newcomer, me. Also, I was disappointed that there were no songbooks and no words projected on a screen, so as much as I wanted to, there was no way I could sing along with the worship. Despite these shortcomings, I decided to continue to attend there for a month of Sundays, 4 Sundays, and then try another church in town that might be a better fit for me. Aside from losing my desire to get high, and a newfound desire to know God, nothing much appeared to have changed after I called out to God. It was almost as if God wanted to help me, but as long as I was smoking, there wasn't much he could do with me. So he had to deal with that first. Because I worked weekday evenings and most churches had their midweek services in the evening, the general manager at the radio station where I was volunteering agreed to meet with me on Thursday mornings for a Bible study. One of the other radio station volunteers, one who had a heart for the Jewish people, told me in a conversation about a group of evangelical leaders that were seeking to create an alliance with Jewish leadership, and that one of the leaders of the evangelical group lived in Sonoma County and went to the Gospel Outreach Church in Santa Rosa. Since I considered myself to be part Jewish, at least by birth, I was interested in learning more. Since the month that the church I had started going to was up, I decided to go to the Gospel Outreach Church next and meet the evangelical leadership person. In addition to having the words for the worship songs projected on the screen so I could, and did, sing along, and people recognizing I was a newcomer coming up to greet me, the Gospel Outreach Church had a potluck after the Sunday morning service that I would stay to fellowship and eat, communicating in one non-judgmental way or another that I was an ovo and lacto-vegetarian. My plan had been to attend this church for a month and then to move on and try out another church for a month. However, on the fourth Sunday, the last one I had planned to attend there, I was informed by some of the women who put the potluck together that next week's potluck was going to be vegetarian, ostensibly in my honor. I guessed that I could wait another week before moving on. I mean, after all, if they were going all this trouble on my account, not showing up would kind of be a slap in the face. When I attended that next Sunday, the pastor apologized to the congregation for his failure to inform them more in advance of an upcoming week-long Institute in Basic Youth Conflict seminar conducted by Bill Gothard that would be starting the next day at the Oakland Coliseum. The way he spoke of it, it sounded very interesting and like it would be a valuable educational experience, especially for a new Christian like me, which it turned out to be. Bill Gothard presented example after example of the applicability of the Bible to everyday life and convinced me that the Bible was relevant and, for all intents and purposes, God's owner's manual for humans to live the satisfying and fulfilling life they want and God intended for us to live and enjoy. After that experience, having a hunger for the things of the Lord, I attended and or participated in almost every opportunity to grow in my knowledge and understanding of God, who He is, and how He works among His people, including several evangelism classes that were available through the church, which I ended up attending regularly. Although I clearly understood the concept of Jesus' substitutionary death, I had a hard time appropriating His sacrifice for myself, as I couldn't see anything I had ever done that was deserving of death. There was the stapler I had stolen from a previous employer back in the 70s, but that would hardly be deserving of the death penalty. I had attempted to return the stapler after having come to see myself as a Christ follower. However, the business I had stolen it from apparently wasn't in business any longer. Maybe the stapler was more important than I had thought. A few months after I started going to the Santa Rosa Gospel Outreach Church, they had a joint meeting with the Gospel Outreach Church in Guerneville. It was after that I began to regularly attend the Guerneville Church. This was partly because the church was actually closer to where I was living in Forestville, and partly because there appeared to be some single women with whom I might be able to get into a relationship. In the meantime, with my background in sales and marketing, I had a brilliant idea: creating a Christian business directory. That's when someone told me there already was one, called the Christian Yellow Pages, CYP. Somehow I managed to get in touch with the CYP publisher in Sacramento, Barbara, and ended up becoming the Sonoma County sales representative, putting together the first exclusively Sonoma County CYP directory. Since the selling season for an annual book is relatively short, being about 3 months, I soon was looking at finding another job, as I had found and married a woman at the Guerneville Gospel Outreach Church, Mary, a widow with 2 children. So now I had a family to support. I ended up with a telemarketing job in the copier industry, selling maintenance agreements. Interestingly enough, during this time, Johanna, one of the little girls at our church, was at her home and had put a pillow under her blouse. She told her mother, Michelle, that she was married. Her mother thought she had meant Jesus' mother, but when she said something to that effect, she was corrected. No, Mary Badu, she was told. At that time, Mary didn't actually know yet that she was pregnant. Although we had been taking contraceptive measures, Mary had become pregnant that January. We both immediately realized that this child must be God's idea. That year, I tried to work with the CYP publisher Barbara on the 1984 Sonoma County directory while I continued working for the copier company, but it was just too much for me, so I had to give up the CYP. Although I worked with them briefly to train a new person, Margaret, who would be putting together that year's Sonoma County directory. One of the reasons I had wanted to work with the CYP was because I had enjoyed working with Christian business people. It was during that time that I had my first connections with the Christian Businessmen's Committee, CBMC, and Full Gospel Business Fellowship in Santa Rosa. So I returned to work at the copier company, and that December became a father to a beautiful little girl. Her mother wanted to name her Betsy so she'd be Betsy Badu. I thought it might be better to name her Elizabeth so she'd have some options in case she didn't think Betsy Badu was so cute. Shortly thereafter, my parents back in New York gave me the funds to rent a VHS camcorder so I could make videos of their new grandchild for them. As time went on, I actually purchased a video camera and a separate VHS tape deck for recording the videos. Although there was no problem with the finished products, which I sent copies of to my parents, the only monitor I had while I was recording was the little less than 2-inch black and white screen in the video camera. That's when I had the idea to purchase a little 5-inch color TV to use as a monitor. Not having the total amount needed for the purchase, I put the television on layaway at the Kmart down the street from where I worked. When I picked the television out, I noticed that there was a name written on the box, making it look like maybe it had been a return. It was the name of Margaret's husband, so I decided to call her to confirm if it had been a return, and if so, why. As it turned out, it was a return, but there had been nothing wrong with it. In the course of the conversation, we talked about the CYP, and she told me they were looking to hire a regional sales manager for Northern California, Sacramento, Solano, Napa, Sonoma, Marin, and Monterey counties. I was intrigued, and so I called Barbara, the publisher, to find out more about this opportunity. It sounded like a great opportunity. Not only would I be responsible for training a crew of local sales representatives, but I would also have occasion to interact with the Christian businesses that would be our advertisers. Barbara described some working conditions of employment that I saw as challenges, and so I wanted to be sure that this was what God wanted for me. Since I had a family to support and would be leaving a regular job that I had worked for several years, I decided I would follow Gideon's example and lay a fleece out to confirm that it would be the right decision. I wish I remembered all the conditions, but one I do remember was that they wanted me to work from my home, and I would have preferred to work from an office I could go to each morning. Also, there were 3 other such conditions, and finally, there was the publisher's desire that I also sell advertising. I laid out the first 4 conditions, which I would specifically state had to change, as the fleece. Finally, I did ask God to arrange it so I wouldn't have to sell, but I didn't plan on making it a part of the fleece or saying anything to the publisher about that one. When I talked with Barbara again a few days later, she agreed to each of the changes I required that I had included in the fleece I laid before the Lord. She said she could arrange for me to have space in a client's office where I would work, and she agreed to the other 3 requirements I had. At the end of our conversation, she told me, "Oh, we've been talking about it, and we've decided that we want you to focus all your energies on working with the sales representatives." So in answer to prayer, I wouldn't need to be doing any selling myself. Well, that did it for me. It sure looked like God was giving me the green light. I gave notice at the copier company and prepared to begin working for the CYP as the regional sales manager for Northern California. The CYP headquarters publisher's office was in Fair Oaks, a suburb of Sacramento, where Barbara and her husband Dell lived at the time, which was about a 3-hour drive from my home in Sonoma County. So Barbara was going to put me up in a motel for the first weekend I'd be working for them, and needed to be at the Fair Oaks office. Coincidentally, the annual Cal Expo California State Fair, where the CYP would have a presence, was being conducted in Sacramento that weekend as well. So it looked like it was going to be a busy weekend. It was then that I discovered that neither Barbara nor her husband Dell owned the Christian Yellow Pages name, but they were licensing it. What came as a shock was the news that the owner of the name wanted to reclaim the name for the California market, which would mean not only would Barbara and Dell be out of a job, but so would I. That night, when I went back to the motel, I was distressed. But then God reminded me that I had sought His guidance and it indicated I should take this opportunity. It also came to my mind that He wouldn't bring me into the wilderness to destroy me. So a peace settled over me. At this point in my life, I had a full beard. Not so much because I liked a beard as much as I had a major problem with ingrown facial hairs. Whenever I'd shave, I'd have to spend 15 or 20 minutes picking and or plucking ingrown hairs out. So I had to decide after picking the ingrown hairs out that if I didn't pluck them out or shave, they wouldn't grow back into my face. But for some reason that weekend I felt that the beard wasn't appropriate to my role at CYP. Before I shaved it off, I made a deal with the Lord. I told Him that if He didn't want me to have a beard, all He had to do was remove the problem with the ingrown hairs. So I shaved, and I haven't had a problem with ingrown facial hairs ever since that day. So I guess He prefers me to be clean shaven. Over the course of the next 9 months, I traveled around the CYP's Northern California market, working with the local sales representatives. I created sales training literature, and after God gave me the necessary insights, a piece presenting the various reasons for a CYP directory from the business advertiser's point of view, the consumer shopper's point of view, and finally, from God's point of view. During this period, Barbara and Dell, who had previously moved out of state, relocated back to the Sacramento area, and Barbara made the decision to take on managing the local Sacramento market. This latter decision, although it potentially could have a major impact on my income, as I was also compensated for the sales activity of the salespeople I managed, was not discussed with me. I was offended that this decision was made without discussion, and so I quit. I filed for unemployment. That was contested by Barbara, who had pointed out that I had voluntarily quit. On the basis of that, it was denied. Consequently, I appealed on the basis that their unilateral action substantially changed the terms of our verbal employment agreement, impacting my earnings potential and thereby justifying my terminating my employment with them. I had researched and presented precedent for my position. I prevailed in the appeal and was awarded unemployment insurance compensation. It should be noted that although I had sought God's guidance in deciding to accept employment, I did not seek Him in making the decision to terminate it. As hard as I tried after that, I could not find employment. Circumstances at home necessitated me having to live with a friend, Patrick, while I continued my job search. The feeling I had was that God was responding to my decision to quit the CYP. You don't want to work in the situation I provided? Then you're on your own in finding something else. It was during this time, however, that God gave me a ministry to Christian business people, which came to be known as biblical business. The first teaching He gave me had to do with accounts receivable, and I called it Christian collections. Patrick had a computer, something I had not had access to for personal use up until then, that I used to put together a flyer for a Christian collections class. I showed it to some of the leaders at the CBMC and was given an opportunity to present the class at a weekly meeting. As a part of the ministry, I believe God gave me an insight into what being a Christian in or out of business was all about that I called a foundational perspective. It was in October of 1992 that I received a phone call from a friend, Steve, with whom I had attended the Gospel Outreach in Santa Rosa. He excitedly told me about an incredible 4-day Christian workshop called Momentous that he and his wife had just completed. The people who put the training on were having a free informational meeting that evening, which he encouraged me to attend. His excitement impressed me, and so I decided I would go and find out more. I was so impressed with the information that was presented at the informational meeting that I felt I would benefit from attending the full training, even though it would cost around $300, which really wasn't in my budget, but turned out to be well worth it. The workshop started on a Thursday morning, and when that day's session was over that evening, the participants were given assignments to be completed for the next morning's session. When we returned on Friday morning, each participant was asked to report on their experience with the previous day's homework assignment. The way the training was set up, the trainer had a support team made up of training alums. When an older gentleman was reporting on the reasons, making up excuses, why he had not completed the assignment, a younger man about my age from the support team came forward to confront his excuses, telling him that excuses were standard operating procedure for him. As it was, he was the older gentleman's son. While this was going on, I could sense the tension between them and was thinking one or the other, I'm not sure which one the thought was directed at, should tell the other, "I love you." When that part of the training was over, the next exercise we were asked to participate in involved a quiet time of prayer. We went into a smaller room. The lights were turned down. I remember being on my knees talking to God. However, for some reason, perhaps the earlier events with the father and son, my thoughts were going to relations between fathers and sons. And that's when I started to think about my relationship with my oldest boy, Peter. As I thought about the events of that summer I had described earlier in this piece, I realized how I had betrayed his trust and crushed his hope. In that moment, I saw it as spiritual abuse, hurting his little spirit in a way that was likely more devastating than had I physically abused him. And thinking about this spiritual abuse, it occurred to me that if someone did that to a child, they deserved to die. It was in that moment that I realized I was the one deserving of death. With that realization, I immediately had a sense of Jesus standing behind me, and he said, "That's why I died." I was glad to finally understand what he had done for me. Even though it was 9 years since I began attending church, I see that as the day I actually became a Christian, as I was finally able to appreciate and appropriate what he had done for me. Now, with the understanding I had of his substitutionary sacrifice from all of the evangelism classes I had taken, probably at least 3, I could have thought of his saying that myself. He went on to say something that I never would have thought of on my own. He didn't say, "So how are you going to make it up to him?" And he didn't say, "How are you going to pay for what you've done? What punishment are you going to inflict upon yourself?" What I sensed him saying next was, "So what are you going to do different?" As a result of the challenges to my thinking provoked by the training, I made the decision to remain committed to my wife in marriage, even though we were separated at the time. I also developed the following personal mission statement for my life. I am a transformer facilitator, making a positive difference in the lives of others by being honest, open, and sharing of myself and my feelings with others, generous of my time with others, sensitive to the needs and desires of others, a resource for meeting the needs of others, a source of honest feedback and encouragement for others. I am a vehicle of God's love, moving beyond my personal comfort zone with the result that others experience a transformation accomplished by the Holy Spirit, Zechariah 4:6, from being whom the world, including themselves, has defined them to be into being who God has created them to be. It was after this training that I started to use some of what I had learned as a part of an enhanced ministry to Christian business people that I called Balaam's Donkey Communication Ministry. The idea for the name evolved from the idea that if God can use a donkey, Numbers 22:28, he could certainly use me, or you if you're willing. In 1995, living in Shasta County, I began publishing and editing a successful monthly business publication which became known as the Shasta Business Journal. From time to time, I might mention something from the Bible in an editorial or in an occasional Ask Biblical Business column that I contributed. However, when the events of September 11, 2001 occurred, I realized several things. These were the end times and we were under spiritual attack. It was then that I started to question what I was doing to serve the kingdom of God. After seeking his guidance in prayer and considering the feedback I had gotten from others over the years, I felt led to pursue a career in counseling. At the time, the quickest route to becoming a counselor was through substance use disorder treatment, where one could become a counselor with a minimum of specialized education. Although I did complete a year of upper division chemical dependency studies through a Cal State extension class. As time went on, God opened a door and I began working in substance use disorder treatment in 2003 as a chemical dependency counselor and assistant director. After working with clients in the program, I realized just how much I had become that vision statement I had created so many years before. And that's it.